spirit and stories reflect our deepest truths. I'm your host Shreya, and today's guest is Merlin L. Marquard, a seeker, researcher, and survivor by proxy. When cancer hits his family, Merlin didn't surrender. He studied. What he discovered in the depths of this scientific literature and through the emotional storm that followed might just reframe how we understand healing.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
And Merlin, your journey into cancer research began in crisis. So, what shifted inside you when your father was diagnosed?
That's a very good question. So I've always been, I don't know if it's unable or unwilling to accept bad news at face value. So I didn't just say, okay, I mean, he's got cancer, whatever, we can't do anything. We'll just, be along for the ride, so to speak. I've always been bad at just accepting that. So instead of doing that, I just began, doing the other thing that, or the only other thing that I thought I could do, which is choose to learn about cancer.
Mm.
And I was very, very lucky that I was already at that time studying molecular biotechnology. So I had all of the basic understanding of cellular mechanics, of cellular biology, of human biology, to actually be able to read and comprehend the scientific literature. And the most interesting thing I found after starting to read is that it wasn't as hopeless and the news weren't as bad as I thought they were at first. And that kind of gave me, motivation and more strength to continue down that path. But at the end of the day, it truly just started with my non-capability of just accepting that my dad was going to die. Obviously, I love my dad. I didn't want him to die. So it all kind of came from that, from a deep desire to have him live and also to have him be able to become a grandfather, right? Because I don't have kids yet. I intend on having kids, and I wanted him to get to be a grandfather. So that's kind of where I came from.
Yes, that's a beautiful story. And then, that fear or love or curiosity that drove you deep dive into the science?
I think I think it was, I mean, a very big factor or big driver for me is curiosity in any case. So I think that is perhaps the biggest driver that led me into reading the literature and actually going down this rabbit hole. But I think there was also this big factor of love, obviously, because um, I saw, it affected us all. It most of all, I would say, affected our mum, and seeing how it affected our dad and our mum, and also how it affected us ourselves, right? These news, I did, I, I didn't want to just not do anything. That to me was not an option to just remain inactive or just stationary or static. I needed to do something, and even if the research I did wouldn't have helped, I think I was curious, and I think that's just a basic nature I have. I'm inquisitive, I'm curious, but I was primarily driven by a sense of love and duty to not just surrender.
Yeah, that kind of urgency often unlocks a purpose we never planned, but one that becomes non-negotiable. And
Yeah,
also, you mentioned findings in mainstream science that could radically help patients, but that are overlooked. So, why do you think these discoveries are not more widely embraced?
I think that's really really good question. I think there's primarily probably two mechanisms behind why this mainstream science hasn't made it out yet, so to speak. And I think primarily it's because it's relatively recent. Um, so the papers I'm referring to and the publications I'm referring to, there are some earlier ones from, let's say, 1990, I think even there was one 1979, which is very, very old, I would say, comparatively at least. But most of the papers on which we kind of base everything we do and what we did for our dad, um, most of these papers came out after 2015, even after 2020. So they've been out for under 5 years, most of them. And it just takes a lot longer than 5 years for this information to be communicated and propagated and actually, get to the patient. So we see this with a lot of things that usually in research that are found and then they're reproduced and then they're verified. And then throughout years, oftentimes multiple decades, they then slowly trickle down to the patient. And these things have been mainstream science for 5 years, maybe a decade, at least in that research field. But that's just not enough time for it to make it to the patient. And then I obviously also think there's a second part to this, because there is some science which actually does make it to the patient within months of the release of that information. But that is science that is specifically sponsored and paid for by big medical corporations who have an interest in that information being communicated. So they will obviously engage in direct communication and basically do what we're attempting to do for this, but with the information that supports their own treatments and their own interventions, etc. So I think that that's these two kind of mechanisms that go hand in hand there, that very few people have an interest in propagating this information, financially speaking, at least. And then it's just there hasn't, there wasn't a lot of time for it to spread.
Yes, thank you for sharing this. And also, what barriers, like cultural, systematic, or psychological barriers, do you believe that are most responsible for this?
You mean for this information not to come out, or?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's a very good question. What cultural or mental barriers? I I think there's this. I I think that's culturally mostly, um, where we have this view that with a lot of chronic diseases generally, but especially with cancer, that these diseases are a kind of life sentence, right? You get them, they're there, and you can't do anything against them or about it. And I think that's a very cultural thing, simply, or that arose simply from it being true for so long. Like there were maybe some fringe people who had some novel ideas on cancer treatments that have, had success over the years, but these are fringe cases, not mainstream science. Um, so they don't really get into the mainstream culture. And I think that's just how the dynamics work there. But I think culturally, we do believe that cancer is just lethal, that we simply cannot do anything against cancer. And I think this culture is also kind of self proliferative, right? Because you have the idea that that you can't do anything against cancer, and then you yourself or someone in your family gets cancer, and because you think you can't do anything against cancer, you won't even try. That means that you also won't find out whether that cultural conception is even true. So we have this system where you then have this self-propagation of this cultural idea that cancer is just a life sentence or a death sentence. And to break that, I think you need either a very inquisitive person who then goes, I maybe I'm doomed to die with this cancer diagnosis, or maybe not, and then just goes out and looks for the information. But I think just culturally we're not very inquisitive in that direction because we've simply accepted that cancer, yeah, I mean, you get cancer, you die, maybe you survive a few years, some lucky ones even a few decades, right? But generally, if you get cancer, you die. And I think that's kind of a self-propagating system. Yeah. Where people will accept that they will die, and because of that, they won't look for solutions, let's say outside the box or just solutions in general. And then, you know, it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
But access or awareness doesn't follow that. And also, cancer isn't just a physical illness, it's deeply emotional. So, what do you believe is the mental and spiritual toll it takes on patient and families?
I mean, I've seen this firsthand and experienced this firsthand with the diagnosis on my father. And I'm going to split the question between spiritual and emotional. And I think of emotional, I think more of along the lines of kind of the physiological aspects of that. So what happens to your body when you are emotional, and then spiritual is more like the mental identity kind of aspect of that. Just to make it a bit clearer. Um, I think emotionally or physiologically, when you go through that and have a loved one, or even yourself, you have cancer. But I'm going to speak of the example of a loved one having cancer. It's draining because either you accept it and then you're basically already grieving your loved one because you know they're going to die, or you don't accept it, but you can't just ignore the truth that you have cancer, right? And you know that or we all know that or think to know at least, that cancer is dangerous. So even if you don't accept it, now you'd have no other option than being on on the ball all the time and looking into this and helping your family member out and supporting them wherever you can. And that can be, no, it cannot be. It simply is extremely stressful, and it's emotionally draining. And I think it's very, very difficult to keep up with, to keep, how do you say this? To keep the emotional engagement up when you're basically slogging through a very extended battle against cancer, or war on cancer, I should say, because it's mostly fought in various theaters of war against cancer. Um, and this is, it's it's tiring. You don't, your body starts just not being able to handle the stress, and you start becoming less productive, and you get less sleep. You start performing worse at sports, you start eating worse, and that then leads to a downward spiral. So you kind of, it's difficult to balance that emotionally, to say, okay, I won't give up, um but I also can't use every waking hour, literally every waking hour, on this problem, because this will just, it will drain you. And it drained me, I have to be quite honest. It led to me actually having to extend my bachelor studies of molecular biotech, because just simply I didn't have, or I didn't, I wasn't fast enough in learning to kind of separate that. And I just, I used a lot of time and just on this problem, right? And that kind of led to me not being able to study, and also not being able to focus on studying, because I was just, my head was with my dad's cancer diagnosis all day, every day. And I think that's kind of the more the emotional side. Um, spiritually, I think it actually, funnily enough, spiritually, it strengthened me, I think. Um, because if you are in such a protracted battle against such a, at least conceptually vicious disease, you kind of just need to develop or cultivate faith and trust in that what you're doing is able to help or might be able to help, because otherwise you're just going to drown. And for me, that was very, very clear. I just, I truly just in that period became much more spiritual, much more, I don't know, I would say spiritual in tune, just in general with the world and with God as well, or if you want to call it the divine per se. And I think that diagnosis was also part of kind of fostering that, because if you don't have that faith, if you don't have that kind of anchor line, I think I would have drowned. I don't know if everyone would have, but I certainly would have drowned. And so spiritually, it forced me to develop actually positively, which I'm very grateful for. But emotionally, it was very, very draining, and to the point of actually negatively impacting, my life, my career, my education, etc. Not towards cancer, because now I know a lot about cancer because it just was on my mind all the time, but in other aspects of life.
Yes, it really needs more power to. I think sometimes the mental healing is just as vital as the physical and often more neglected. And
Yeah.
also,
Yes.
yes, and what role do you believe faith or inner strength plays in recovery or endurance alongside science?
I actually think that science is just a treasure trove of information, and information in and of itself is interesting, but not particularly useful. Um, you kind of need to go from that into an adaptation or implementation of that information, and only then it becomes useful. And that interface between information or science and then implementing it into your life, that is already, you know, emotionally, spiritually, and also just mentally loaded, right? Because you need to change your patterns, perhaps you need to change your views, you need to change your habits, your routines. And I think it's pretty obvious that in healing, on two ways, your spiritual mental side is very, very important. Firstly, we know of the placebo effect, and we know that just someone thinking themselves healthy has an actual positive effect on their health. Um, we actually, when we conduct studies on new medication, we test it against the placebo effect, because of the placebo effect being that powerful. It's not just, oh, that's just placebo, meaning that doesn't work. No, no, placebo works. And that's all mental. That's all mental, spiritual side of healing. So we know that that works. We know that that has an effect. And thereby, it also is very important in healing. Because if you can get that extra, I don't know what it is, 10, 20% of healing, that might just, push you over the edge and get you to live a long and healthy life. But also on the other side, when you implement all of this scientific information, which is, the most difficult part about this, learning isn't difficult. Implementing what you learned is way, way more difficult. That needs, as you've said, perseverance. That needs endurance. And without that, if you don't have the mental, spiritual, psychological side down in being able to endure this constant implementing, or this constant learning of implementation, this constant changing and improving what you do every day to fight cancer, if you're not able to endure through that and to basically keep it up because you have faith in it working, because you have mental fortitude and patience and endurance, there's nothing anyone can do for you, because if you stop working at the problem will just grow. And that is, I think, the the most important part about being able to outlive and even potentially fully cure cancer is truly mental. And it comes in the form of the placebo effect and of just having the endurance to implement the knowledge you gain, actually use it. Um, so I think the mental side is actually by far the bigger side, in as much as without it, nothing can help you. And with it, basically any good information can help you, So it's kind of the deciding factor in my view.
Yes, this is with you. So if after this my listeners want to connect with you, then what's the best way?
I think connect with me is probably easiest, just on X, on Twitter, on what was once Twitter. Um, I have my account there. That's just, I sometimes post some interesting things there that I come across. I'm not particularly active on a week by week basis there. So if uh, if viewers or listeners want some more information, I think our YouTube channel is very, very good at that. That would be just Marchwood on YouTube, at Marchwood. And, we have a website as well where they can go, just look what we do. There's a kind of knowledge base of articles on there about cancer and about the things we learn about as we learn them. And yeah, I mean, if someone in your listening base knows someone who has cancer or has themselves cancer, firstly, obviously, my heart goes out to you. I truly understand the just strain it causes, the pain, the strain, the stress it causes, and I there's nothing I can do to take that side of it. But we do have a community project which we're building, which is intended to help with that a bit by allowing the cancer patient to socialize with others who are going through the same struggle. And that would be accessible at marchwood.com/outlive. And that's kind of what we're trying to build, a kind of international network of cancer patients, and learning how to heal cancer from their side of the park, not just giving it all up to doctors, but actually, supporting and perhaps even outpacing what doctors can do, and also socializing with others, because I think that's also very important in humans, is to have this um, connection, community with others that are going through the same struggles. I found it helpful myself, um, and I think others will have or find help in that as well.
Yeah, and I will make sure to attach all the details or links below so that the listeners can find them easily and get in touch with you. And thank you for joining us and sharing all your
Thank you for
experiences,
having me.
your knowledge with us. And to my listeners, Merlin's story reminds us that healing is never just physical. It's scientific, emotional, and spiritual. And sometimes it begins when, if you are facing the unthinkable, know this: there is more than hope. There is knowledge, there is support, and there is soul. Until next time, stay informed, stay brave, and stay deeply connected to life.